So today, we're going to pull back the curtain on a story that's been over a century in the making. We're talking about the hidden history of U.S. drug policy and how, time and again, it's been used less for public health and more as a powerful weapon for social control.
And that really gets to the core question of this entire explainer. What if the drug laws that have shaped American society for generations were never actually about the drugs themselves? What if they were about something else entirely?
To even begin to answer that, we've got to go way back, right back to the beginning, to see the first clear examples where policy wasn't a shield to protect the public, but a weapon pointed squarely at specific groups of people.
Okay, let's start the clock in 1882. The Civil War is over, but the country is in a huge economic depression. Chinese immigrants, who were absolutely essential in building the Transcontinental Railroad, are suddenly seen as competition for jobs that are getting harder and harder to find. So how do you justify kicking out an entire group of people? Easy. You weaponize their culture. The Chinese Exclusion Act did just that, linking opium use, a pretty common practice in Chinese communities, to this whole story about moral decay. It made them the perfect scapegoat for the country's economic woes.
Now this is where it gets really telling. Look at the crazy double standard here. At the very same time, things like laudanum, medicinal opium products, were totally legal and socially acceptable for white Americans. You could just buy them at the corner pharmacy. But when Chinese immigrants used opium in a cultural setting, suddenly it was a dangerous, criminal vice. You see, it was never really about the drug itself. It was all about who was using it.
And hey, this wasn't just a one-off thing with opium. They used the exact same playbook for alcohol. The temperance movement, with groups like the Anti-Saloon League leading the charge, wasn't just about getting people to stop drinking. Nope, it was about social control. They went after saloons, which were the social and political hearts of German, Irish, and Italian immigrant communities. The goal was to break up their influence and force one specific vision of America on everyone.
So, this pattern of using policy for social control really laid the groundwork for the next big move. As we head into the early 20th century, federal policy started to systematically make not just drug use a crime, but the state of addiction itself.
And that brings us to the Harrison Narcotics Act of 1914. Now you might hear that name and think, the start of the war on drugs. But its original purpose was totally different. It was, believe it or not, a tax law. The whole point wasn't to ban drugs, but just to regulate and keep track of them. Doctors could still prescribe them. The law just meant every single transaction had to be documented and, of course, taxed.
So how in the world did a simple tax law turn into a tool for criminalization? Well, that happened in the courts. Just a few years later, in 1917, a Supreme Court ruling decided that doctors could no longer prescribe maintenance doses to people struggling with addiction. And just like that, overnight, addiction went from being a medical issue you'd see a doctor for to a criminal act that the police would handle. That one decision changed absolutely everything. Fast forward 20 years, and you see them perfect this tactic with the Marijuana Tax Act. Once again, it wasn't an outright ban on paper. Instead, it created a tax stamp that was basically impossible to get. It was a perfect catch-22. To get the stamp, you had to already have the marijuana, but having the marijuana without the stamp was illegal. It was a legislative trap. And just look at the spelling they used, marijuana, with an H. That was a very deliberate choice to tie the drug to Mexican immigrants in the public's mind.
So who was really behind this ban? Well, this slide lays it all out. It had very little to do with public health and everything to do with power and money. You had Harry Anslinger, who wanted to make his federal agency bigger and more powerful. You had Andrew Mellon and the DuPont family, who wanted to crush hemp because it was competition for their new synthetic products like nylon. And you had William Randolph Hearst, who wanted to protect his massive timber empire from the threat of cheaper paper made from hemp. It was a full-blown moral crusade, all built on a foundation of protecting big business interests.
So, this American model of drug policy, born from a mix of xenophobia and economic protectionism, wasn't going to stay inside U.S. borders. The next phase wasn't just about controlling people at home, it was about exporting that model of control to the rest of the world.
In 1961, the United States basically took its show on the road to the United Nations. They initiated this huge treaty, the Single Convention on Narcotic Drugs. The idea was to get every country on the same page, to create one unified set of rules for drug control, a set of rules that, surprise, surprise, looked almost exactly like America's punishment-first approach.
And yeah, the impact of this was absolutely massive. This convention basically globalized the U.S. war on drugs. The American model, the one that puts punishment, arrests, and enforcement way ahead of public health and treatment, became the gold standard for the entire world, and it's had devastating consequences for communities everywhere.
All right, now we're jumping to the 1980s, and this is where things just explode. It was like a perfect storm of political scandals, a terrifying new drug epidemic, and some truly devastating policy choices that would crank up the war on drugs to a level nobody could have imagined.
Just look at how fast all this happened. You've got the Reagan administration secretly funding a war in Nicaragua. At the exact same time, the crack epidemic explodes in communities of color. The government's response? Pass incredibly harsh new sentencing laws. And where all this is going on, federal funding for mental health gets slashed, and the response to the brand new HIV crisis is tragically slow. Each one of these things made the others so much worse.
This chart shows maybe one of the most infamous results of that entire decade. The Anti-Drug Abuse Act of 1986 created a 100-to-1 sentencing disparity between crack cocaine, which was more common in black communities, and powder cocaine, which was more often used by wealthy white people. The law literally said that 1 gram of crack was as bad as 100 grams of powder. This one law is what fueled the explosion of mass incarceration in America.
Now, think about this. At the exact same moment that communities were getting slammed by addiction and a new epidemic, the support systems that could have helped were being systematically torn down. Federal funding for mental health programs was cut by a jaw-dropping 40%. This shut down facilities all over the country, and it left the most vulnerable people with absolutely nowhere to turn, directly leading to more homelessness and addiction.
And then, you had the HIV/AIDS crisis. The official response wasn't just slow, it was actively harmful. A federal ban was put in place that stopped any government money from being used for syringe programs, a tool we already knew was a proven way to stop the spread of disease. This decision, which was based on moral judgment instead of science, turned what could have been a manageable health crisis into an absolute catastrophe.
So, after a full century of policy being used as a weapon, we're left with a pretty clear and devastating legacy. But looking back at all this history also leaves us with a really important choice about where we decide to go from here.
When you just zoom out and look at the big picture, the pattern is impossible to miss. Over and over again, policy has been used to target marginalized groups. Powerful economic interests get protected behind this curtain of a moral crusade. Public health consistently takes a backseat to punishment and control, and the result of all that? A system of mass incarceration and deep systemic inequality that we are still trying to untangle today.
Look, this isn't just a history lesson. It's the direct origin story of the biggest public health and justice system challenges we have right now. All these failures of the past have created this urgent need for a totally different way of thinking, one that isn't based on punishment, but on compassion and actual science. That approach is called harm reduction. It's just a set of practical strategies, like providing clean needles or overdose reversal drugs, aimed at reducing the damage associated with drug use.
And that leaves us with one last big question to think about. After seeing how policy has been used for the last 100+ years, we get to decide what its purpose should be for the next 100. Is drug policy at its core a tool for punishment, or is it a tool for public health? I think after everything we've seen, the choice is ours to make.